Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tink and Wendy by Kelly Ann Jacobson. Narrated by Eleanor Mccormick. Part 1. Chapter 1. Introduction. Excerpt from Neverland, A History. Not many people know this, but the fairies were the ones who created Neverland in the first place. Before they planted the seed of the first Never tree in Neverland's fertile ground, that starfish-shaped rock had been just that, a rock where pirates on their way to better lands docked for a few days to stretch their legs, or to bury their treasures in the lagoon where many years later mermaids would find the gold coins and use them as decorations for their hair. This was 100 years before anyone had heard of Peter Pan or the Lost Boys or Wendy, or even Tinker Bell. That last name, I must pause to acknowledge, is the reason I have been tasked with the honor of writing this volume, the first ever history of what has become quite a legendary land. I was Tink's superior officer at the time of her assignment to watch over Peter Pan, and in fact, it was I who selected her from the dozens of new recruits who needed posts. Why, you might ask, did I choose such a strong-willed, anti-authoritarian, at times even ill-mannered fairy for such an important task? Obviously, you never met Peter. Chapter 2. Now. Tink wakes early, at the time when the sun blinks through the trunks of the elms around her cottage and through the missing pane of her front window, and then turns her back on the new day. The sun, like a dog, chases her over the wool blanket, against the wall, into the bed, until she has no choice but to push off her covers and meet the morning. The wood floor is cold against her bare feet. The water in her basin is cold, though she splashes her face anyway and wipes herself on a grimy hand towel on the table. The fabric of her army jacket is cold until the heat of her body warms it. Everything is cold in upstate New York. There might be more snow later, though Tink doesn't have that special itch in her nose that precipitates a storm. Her breath hangs in front of her as a brief specter, then disappears, leaving her gaunt face in the mirror. She looks hung over. She is hung over. The bottle of wine she stole from the bar in town lies empty on its side, a dribble of red liquid now stained on the wooden table. They know her by name. They have her picture hung up next to the cash register. Underage do not serve. Tink smears her short blonde hair back, and it stays that way, slick with grease. She zippers up the jacket. Her eyes are bloodshot and fearless, like a rabid animal's. Her skin is dull. Once, a long time ago, she was beautiful. But those days are long gone. Or rather, she has banished them. Beauty has never brought her anything, and she's tired of expecting otherwise. After she turns away from the mirror, she slides on her boots and takes up her bucket filled with tools: soft bristle brush, wood scraper, sponge, and a piece of flannel ripped from an old shirt. She rips a chunk from a loaf of stale bread, finds the butter in the fridge, and slides the rough edge of the bread over the butter slab. When she bites into it, crumbs scatter on the floor. Her thermos is waiting on the counter, and she fills it with the coffee from her automatic machine and screws on the lid. Later, the heat from the liquid will bring her some comfort. When she steps outside, snow slides off the roof onto her head. She shakes off the flakes, though a few have already melted onto her head, and then slips her jacket's hood up. Her boots crunch footprints into the snow where she walked the night before, the steps going in the opposite direction, longer and heavier and more prone to spills on the slippery stones beneath. She doesn't remember walking back from the bar, but the steps are inarguably hers. No one else in town has such small feet. If she thinks very hard, she can remember the perfect 80-degree days of Neverland. The slight mist in the air from the lagoon. In the distance, the sound of boys calling out, mostly for Peter. The breeze would tickle her wings and send a chill of anticipation down her spine, for whenever there was a breeze, Peter would come knocking at her door. "Tink, it's flying weather," he would say, and she would drop whatever she was doing to pass the time between his visits and dive out to meet him. It's flying weather, but also cross the ocean weather, into the window of an unsuspecting child weather, meeting Wendy weather. Weather that seemed temperate at the time, though when Tink looks back, there were storms on the horizon. But to fly, to have the wind lift you up by your wings and carry you, to have everything you know grow small, the way a day grows small to someone as stuck in time as she and Peter. What was a single day among so many wonderful days? It's flying weather. Tink crosses her yard to the wrought iron fence and opens the gate with her elbow. Still, the cold metal finds its way through the fabric of her jacket, and she shivers. The tools in her basket chatter like teeth. Once she rushes through, the gate creaks closed behind her, like the closing of a book, like the end of a life. Not that an immortal fairy like Tink would know about that. The path that leads from Tink's cottage to the main road is perilous, not just slippery, but also steep and sown with knotted roots. She trips a few times on the way up and has to grab a branch here and there with her free hand to remain upright. A rabbit, gray the way the snow will turn after she has walked this path a few times, hops from the bramble and then back again. This will likely be the only life Tink sees all day. When she gets to the main road, which is really an unused dirt road that she shares with the few other inhabitants of these woods, she hurries on her way so she won't risk running into one of her well-meaning neighbors. 100 feet away, she turns sharply left again, and through another iron gate, this one adorned by a pattern of roses. 3 markers forward, 2 to the left, another 3. And there they are. 2 headstones between the evergreens on the border of the cemetery, only inches apart and marked with identical swans. What's all the fuss about? Tink thought when she first saw them. After all, when you have your own wings, there isn't anything special about a clumsy white bird swimming around a lake half the time. But Peter had always admired them. "Do you know they mate for life?" he'd said, and Tink had turned her nose up at the prospect. They were, after all, back in Neverland, where the closest anyone came to mating for life was a lost boy writing a love letter to one of the mermaids. "Want to go to the bonfire with me tonight? Circle yes or no." She had turned her nose up, and yet, far below the surface, something had stirred in her, like a fish so far down in the lagoon that it was a mere shadow, just barely visible from Marooner's rock. Something older. This was no child's crush, and yet they were children, she and Peter, or at least that's how they appeared, and how they acted, and what they told themselves they were. Never growing up. And yet, she began to notice things about Peter. His long, gangly legs, the strong hands used to slick the fairy dust from her skin, the way he looked when he was thinking happy thoughts, like ice cream and puppies and rainbows filling the sky. She wanted him to look that way at her, but he only ever teased her, his silly fairy girl. "It's flying weather," he said, and she had said, "Oh, how I love to fly." But what she'd meant was, "Oh, I love you, Peter." A man would have understood, but Peter was no man. Not then. Tink ends her journey at the twin headstones. There are no years listed on one, The other, inscribed Wendy Darling, marks her as the youngest of all those buried in the cemetery. Tink kneels and cleans out some moss growing in the number 8, then wipes the snow and dirt from the top of the stone with the soft flannel shirt piece until it shines. Wendy would have done a better job, Tink thinks, and then she wipes the stone a second time for good measure. Once Wendy's stone looks presentable, Tink moves to the second stone, but like always, she cannot bring herself to touch even the top of it with her swatch. "Damn you," she mutters. In the trees, birds wake at the sound of her voice and throw themselves into the wind. They'll be back to roost, Tink knows, the way that she and Peter always went back to Neverland, until the night they didn't. "Damn you," she says again. "Why couldn't you just go home, the way you always did?" But she's talking to empty air. The birds aren't there, and Peter certainly isn't there. And why isn't he here, Tink? She drops the flannel piece in the snow and doesn't pick it up again. Because Peter is dead. Chapter 3. Then. Tinker Bell and Peter had several favorite haunts, one of them being Big Ben, which they visited first that fateful night, and another right across the ocean at Niagara Falls. It was actually Tinker Bell who chose their destination. She loved the way the green water, tinted by the tiny rocks ground from the bed of the Niagara River, forced itself forward like a horse that was its own master. "Watch this," Peter called from behind the falls. Tink could barely make him out, illuminated though he was in the glow of her fairy dust, until with a surge of force he pounded through the largest portion of water, Horseshoe Falls, and did a series of front flips to where she hovered. Tink put out her arms, always ready to catch him should he lose control, but Peter stopped inches from her face and gave her a beaming smile. "Silly Peter," Tink said, but she couldn't help smiling back. "I am silly," he admitted. He ran a hand through his short red hair and then replaced his green cap. "But that's what you like about me, isn't it?" "Of course it is." "Good, because I have a surprise for you," Peter said. Then he wrung his wet cap over her head. Tink tried to swat the hat away, but Peter was too quick for her. She chased him into the water, out of the water, the force of the falls like a giant hand trying to squash her every time she moved through it, until they were both tired and panting and sweating, though you couldn't tell because they were so wet. "Let's take a break," said Peter, and he flew back through the falls to their secret cave. Tink followed, landing on a rock that served as their only chair, like a butterfly alighting on the petal of a flower. Peter shook his head like a dog, and Tink spun so that droplets flung from her skirt onto the walls of the cave. After they were as dry as they could be sitting in a damp cave, the two friends sat down on the rock and shared a bar of chocolate Peter had kept safe in a plastic bag in his pocket. All residents of Neverland loved chocolate, but none more than Peter, and whenever he and Tink left home, they always raided a different candy store in order to replenish their stash. "Better than sleeping in all day," Peter said as he chowed down on a second chunk. "Better than swimming in the lagoon on a warm afternoon," Tink said. She closed her eyes and let her piece melt on her tongue. "Better than Christmas morning," Peter said. "Better than a mother's kiss," Tink said. No one said anything for a long time after that. Neither Peter nor Tink had a mother, or rather, Tink didn't have a mother, and Peter had never known his. And yet they both yearned for the feeling of a mother's arms, the way someone who has never seen the ocean yearns to put their feet in the lapping waves. "We should get going," Peter said, and Tink agreed, though there was no schedule to their wanderings. They came and went as they pleased, staying in one place only long enough for Tink to replenish her dust or Peter to direct the Lost Boys on a project they should finish before he returned. This time they were hard at work making arrows Peter could lace with a sleeping potion, should Captain Hook and his dreaded crew sail back to Neverland. Now, when Tink thinks back to the moment when she pushed back through the falls into the cool fall air, she wonders how different things would have been if she had just aimed a little more to the left, or to the right, or up, or anywhere but directly ahead, where, unbeknownst to the two beings eating chocolate in the cave, a helicopter had stopped to shine a light on the water below. A man had thrown himself into the falls, as she would find out much later, and the helicopter had been tasked with trying to find him. But directly ahead she went, right into one of the propellers. Since she was a fairy, and fairies are immortal, the helicopter didn't do much damage. It did, however, manage to fling Tink far into the distance, over the top of the falls, and Grand Island, and Buffalo, and all the way to the woods of middle-of-nowhere New York, until she crashed through a layer of trees and down, down, down to the ferns that caught her in their fronds. For a while she lay there in the dark, listening to animals scurry over branches and watching the bugs flitter across the face of the moon. After some time she heard a voice calling out, but instead of her name, the voice was insistently repeating, "Michael? Michael, come out, wherever you are. Michael? This isn't funny, Michael." "Hello?" Tink said during a pause between Michaels. "Hello?" the voice said back. A light emerged in the trees and drew closer. There were two heads, one belonging to a boy of about 15, and one to a girl a few years older than that. The girl had the flashlight, which she shone into Tink's eyes until Tink asked whether she could turn the damn thing off, or at least stop blinding Tink with it. "Language!" the girl scolded. If Tink was feeling up to it, she would have given the girl a certain finger, but she could only weakly blink. "Why do you look so strange?" the boy asked Tink. For a moment she wondered about her wings, but luckily they were only visible to other fairies or those under the influence of their dust. He must have been referring to her outfit, she realized, a green dress the color of a new leaf, and little yellow slippers with flowers blooming on the toes. Tink hated her costume, as she called it when complaining to Peter, but she never knew when her godmother, the fairy in charge of making sure her girls were properly dressed and always behaving in a manner befitting such a magical species, might drop in. "Why do you look so strange?" Tink asked back, and he did, in his old man's button-up shirt and pressed trousers. The girl gave the boy the flashlight and instructed him to keep the beam on Tink. The girl's face was suddenly illuminated, and in that moment, the entire forest went quiet. It was like Tink had been standing next to a speaker at a concert and then stepped outside, or like she had been submerged in the ocean, or like nothing she had ever felt before. The soft brown hair trimmed neatly at the girl's shoulders, the delicate tilt of her nose, the sweater buttoned all the way up to her throat. 3 tiny paintings that separately might not account for much, but that together cause an onlooker to stop and wonder at their microcosmic world. Then the girl bent down out of the light so that her face was a few inches from the fairy, and examined her by first moving one arm, then the other, one leg, then the other, one eye, tested with 2 fingers, then the other. "No permanent damage," the girl declared, and slid her forearm under Tink in order to hoist her up. Normally, Tink would have made a joke about permanent damage not being permanent. She liked to point out when people said stupid things. But she found that she couldn't say much beyond yes and thank you and Michael who. She had even forgotten about Peter. "Michael is our brother," the girl said. "And I'm John Darling," the boy said proudly. "Who are you calling Darling?" Tink scowled, though he probably couldn't see her. "It's our last name," the girl said. Her laugh was like a little bell ringing at the opening of a door. "He's John, darling, and I'm Wendy, darling, and Michael, wherever he's gotten off to, is Michael, darling." "Oh, right." Tink refrained from saying how unfortunate it was to have such a confusing last name. "I'm Tinkerbell. 2 words, 1 first name before you ask." Wendy laughed again, as if Tink had made a joke, and then she and John helped Tink walk back through the woods toward a light in the distance. On the way, they passed several oddities, including a cottage their father had built as a playhouse before he got sick, and the cemetery where their mother was buried. Tink took to the cottage right away, with its quaint thatched roof and round door, probably because it reminded her of her own home back in Neverland, but she was too sore to explore it further. Plus, it had been left in disrepair since their father's illness, said Wendy, pointing out the hole where mice had chewed through the dry reeds. The main house was much larger, but equally shabby. The light illuminating the porch was missing its glass sconce. The rocking chair's wicker had fallen through its frame. One of the windows was taped closed with a layer of plastic, and weeds had taken up residence in every flower bed. "What a lovely home," Tink said. "It isn't really," Wendy said, "but you're kind to say so." "We do our best," John added. Wendy didn't want to risk waking her father, so she and John set Tink down on the porch step next to a pile of black and white fur that turned out to be a dog. Nana was old, John said, or else she would have been out looking for Michael along with the rest of them. "I should get back," Wendy said, her eyes back on the woods. "Michael loves to play hide-and-seek, but he won't come out no matter how long we look. Do you know, one time back in London, he hid in a trash bin behind a bakery for 8 whole hours? The collector found him there the next morning, asleep on the stale rolls." "He sounds like he's a lost boy," Tink said. "He is lost," John said, looking down at Tink through his black-framed glasses. "That's what we've been telling you." Before Tink could explain, which, on further reflection, she probably wouldn't have anyway, for risk of sounding even crazier than they already thought her, 2 dark figures came out of the woods and became a little boy of about 5 and a familiar older boy in a red tunic decorated in leaves. "Peter!" Tink exclaimed, remembering him all at once. "Tink!" Peter rushed to her side. "How funny that you're in the exact last place I expected to find you. Are you hurt, Tink? Can you—" He was probably going to say fly, but he remembered their company and closed his lips tight. "I'll be all right," Tink said bravely. She was fine, with the exception of a headache and a sore arm, but it was nice having people worry over her. She soon realized, however, that Peter was no longer worrying about her or even looking at her. Another girl, almost a woman, had caught his eye. "Peter Pan," Peter said. He took off his cap and bowed, as though he were a gentleman asking a lady to dance. "Wendy, darling," Wendy curtsied. "What is this, the Victorian era?" Tink said loudly, but either no one heard her or they'd chosen to ignore her. She had a bad feeling about this meeting. Very bad. And it was not improved by little Michael, who sat down next to her on the step with a thump and, touching his chubby hand to her cheek, asked in an innocent voice whether this was the kind of fairy who granted wishes or the kind who made Christmas presents in the North Pole. "You mean elves," John corrected. "And you're old enough to know that she's just a girl in a Halloween costume." "But Halloween was last week," Michael insisted. Everyone ignored him, and Tink breathed a sigh of relief. When Wendy asked where Peter and Tink were from, Peter said just down the road, and Tink said Canada. They looked at each other and then said in unison, "Just down the road in Canada, eh?" Tink felt a little bit better. After all, no goody-goody could replace her as Peter's partner in crime. and Peter even winked at her when no one else was looking. "Would you like to come in for some tea before you go back?" Wendy asked. "I don't think we should," Tink started to say, but Peter interrupted her with an enthusiastic, "Absolutely," even though he always said tea was for boring grown-ups. A bad feeling. Very bad. The house was old and full of strange trinkets, like an oil lamp and a typewriter and a wood-burning stove. "Papa used to have an affinity for antiques," Wendy said, as though her father were already dead. The inside of the house was as shoddy as the outside, but the kitchen, where Wendy led them, was kept clean by Wendy's busy hands. No sooner had she put a kettle on the stove than she was washing 5 mugs, putting cookies on a plate, sweeping up the crumbs with the back of her porcelain hand, and wiping Michael's mouth with a linen tea towel. "Delicious," Peter said, though Tink hadn't seen him take a single sip from the blue mug steaming in front of him. Later, he would dump the tea down the sink when only Tink was looking. Tink, on the other hand, loved the taste of chamomile, especially after such an exhausting night. Her eyes blinked, closed, and she had to pinch herself to get them open again. "Look," Michael said, and he pointed to Tink. "The fairy girl is falling asleep." "It's been a long day," Peter said, as though to excuse her for some rudeness, and Tink thought, "Who do you think you're fooling, Peter Pan? This was a boy who fell asleep with his head on the table and a glass of nectar in his hand almost nightly. Maybe we could stay here for the night." Instantly, Tink was wide awake. Stay here? In the real world? Beyond the strangeness of staying in a creepy old house like this one, there was the obvious problem of needing to return Peter to Neverland to keep him immortal. "But, Peter," Tink began. "Of course you can stay," Wendy declared, and Michael clapped his chubby hands together in glee. "I'll make up the guest bedrooms at once. John, Michael, come help with the corners of the bedsheets." No, she said when Tink started to rise. "Not you two. You're our guests." As soon as the darlings were out of earshot, Tink launched into her tirade. "Peter Pan, you naughty boy. You know very well that we can't stay in the real world for even a single night without—" "Quick," Peter interrupted. "Before she gets back, I have to tell you something very important." He tipped his tea down the sink, put the mug back in its place on the table, and then leaned in very close so that Tink could smell the mist of the falls in his clothes. "I'm in love." When Tink looks back on that moment, she can recall every detail. The timid whistling of the just-boiling teapot, the rough surface of the wooden table grooved by so many family dinners, the sound of footsteps above their heads as the darlings prepared their beds. When Tink looks back on that moment, she freezes it there, like pausing a movie. But in the real world, life goes on. Tink knows that better than anyone. "Oh, good, the water is ready," Wendy said as she drifted back into the kitchen with John and Michael at her heels. "More tea, anyone?" Peter lifted his mug enthusiastically. Chapter 4. Founding of the Home Under the Ground. Excerpt from Neverland, a History. After the fairies created a livable geography and populated it with the oppressed groups mentioned in previous chapters, see Mermaids and Native People of Candelon, they still had room in the forest quadrant of Neverland for more creatures. Many petitioned for land, but it just so happened that the Queen's daughter, Princess Fern, had recently been on a mission trip to the real world and attached herself to the cause of the orphans of that realm. Why not give the land to them? She asked. And since her mother's 100-year reign was almost up, the Queen decided to indulge Princess Fern's request. There were, of course, stipulations. Seeing as how anyone in the magical realm was immortal, as long as they didn't get stabbed or eaten by a crocodile, or otherwise maimed or mortally wounded. They could not allow members of both sexes to dwell in Neverland. Just as the mermaids had only girls, the home under the ground would have only boys.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?